to the British. It's about an hour and a half.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Watson Institute for International Studies here at Brown for the discussion of Peter Andreas' new book, Smuggler Nation, How Illicit Trade Made America. Housekeeping, as you heard the buzzword there, I have to mention some things. The way we're going to run this is as follows. I'm going to do a brief and perfunctory introduction. Then Peter is going to get up and talk briefly about the book, because obviously if he doesn't say something about context, given that most of you have not read the book, this will become a stunningly one-way conversation. After this, I will invite Catherine, Richard and James to say their piece on the book, and hopefully we can get stuck into a good discussion of Smuggler Nation and all its aspects. At that point, we will open it up for Q&A. And the Q&A session, you will see there is one fixed microphone there, and there is another mobile microphone for this side of the house. If you wish to join the Q&A, please, if you're on this side, get up and stand behind the microphone. We have to do it this way because there is no mobile miking that we can use for recording for C-SPAN, and we do want your questions and answers to be an integral part of this broadcast. So there we go. Without any further ado, I will begin my brief introduction, even though it's kind of redundant because obviously I've just done an introduction while I was doing the housekeeping. So, here's the book. There we go. It's big. Now, for those of you who know Peter, you will know that this is unusual, because Peter tends to write short books, and there's nothing wrong with that, it's great, but it's a bit of a surprise when you see a big one, because you think to yourself, ooh, this is serious. Now, I'm going to say three things about this book, because I'm not going to get into the details. I want my colleagues to get into this. I'm going to say three general things about the book. The first one is, this book marks Peter Andreas' exit from the community of political scientists. Because it is disturbingly well written. It is actually enjoyable. It is quite readable and clear. It is utterly devoid of jargon. And it contains a powerful, salutary and very political message. The second reason to like this book is that it is not devoid of theoretical, let's say, heft, rather just theoretical pretension. Because what it says, and he riffs off of a well-known sociologist who passed away recently, Charles Tilley, and the standard sort of model we have in the social sciences for how states get formed and build the component parts that they build is that states make war and wars make states. That is to say, you need revenue to go off and beat the living daylights out of other states. So in the process, you develop these extractive and administrative capacities. And how you do this determines the type of state you end up. And Peter's come along and basically said, yeah, that's right, but not quite. Because as well as beating the bejesus out of external foes, there's also your own population. There's also the people who cross your borders. There's also the people you want to keep out, as well as the people that you want to bring in. There's the monitoring, the registering, the capacity building, the engineering that goes on with this that makes a state into a state. And we are remarkably blind, willfully so, as to how much of the state is a police apparatus. And how much of that policing has to do not just with extraction, but with exclusion. And how much of that exclusion has to do with regulations, and regulations as to who we are, and who we think we are, and who we pretend to be in the world. The last thing I want to say about the book by introduction is that there is no entry in the index for the word hypocrisy. But there should be. Because the moral outrage that is buried ever so slightly throughout the book is Peter's outrage over the hypocrisy of all of this. The fact that we have had a 100-year war on drugs that produces nothing except casualties. The fact that the United States was the world's biggest technology stealer throughout the entirety of the 19th century. Didn't give a damn about foreign patents. Imported whatever it liked, reassembled it and called it its own, and then granted a patent for the people in the country who stole it. The fact that we are a nation of astonishing hypocrites is something that we need to come to grips with. I think that Smuggler Nation is a really good way of starting that conversation. So, that's my introduction. I now pass over to the author himself to say why he wrote this book and what he hopes to achieve by doing so.
Thank you, Mark. I actually stole a few of my punchlines, but that's okay. Does it better than I will. I thought it'd be useful just to tell you a little bit about the book before people comment on the book. It'd be a little strange if you didn't know a little bit of background about it. First, I'll tell you very briefly what the motivation was. And the motivation is really that I can't think of any policy debate today in Washington which suffers from a more severe case of historical amnesia than discussions about border control, border policing, transnational crime, illicit trade, trafficking of all sorts. And the more I looked into this area, which I've been working on for quite some time, I feel like you need to dig not just years or decades, but in fact, centuries. So this is a corrective of sorts, bringing history back in, if you will. And the argument is really the subtitle of the book, How Illicit Trade Made America. And to my great surprise, perhaps satisfaction as a writer, I discovered the argument was even more true than I thought at this outset, which is you can't really even explain the founding of the country, the American Revolution, the New Republic, wars of various sorts, which I'll tell you a little bit more in a second, westward expansion, the slave trade, economic development, border dynamics, and so on, without taking into account smuggling dynamics of various sorts. So we put that more front and center in the story of America. Retelling the American epic through the lens of smuggling is what this book does. And there's actually a large literature out there on various pieces of this, right? The drug trade, migration, and so on. But this is a 300-year sweep. And so it's kind of a first take. I'm sure it's a flawed book, as some of my colleagues will tell you maybe. But it's a first take of sort of rereading the American epic and its relations, and America's relations with the rest of the world through the lens of smuggling and illicit trade. And since we're here at Brown University, where I teach and your students and my colleagues, one thing that I found particularly interesting and quite dramatic and shocking is the importance of Brown University and the Brown brothers and Rhode Island, a tiny state, the tiniest state in the nation, punching above its weight significantly in the realm of illicit trade from the very beginning. And the great irony that I trace in the book is that a country that grew up through smuggling, in fact, was given birth partly through smuggling, is today the world's leading policing superpower, the most aggressive, enthusiastic, anti-smuggling crusader, if you will. So it's quite a transformation. Mark used the word hypocrisy. Certainly there is hypocrisy in there, but it's not only not in the index, I'm not even sure the word hypocrisy appears in the text itself. Amazon, if you know, you can go to search inside the book. I'm wondering if you punch in the words hypocrisy, does it come up? Because I haven't checked. So let me just tell you, just a few minutes of my time, 4 stories. I can't tell you the whole book. There's 16 chapters and so on, but 4 stories. One is a story about the relationship between illicit trade and warfare. And all these stories, by the way, have contemporary resonance, relevance, lessons for today. So there's much talk today about the relationship between conflict commodities and war. So for example, cocaine-financed guerrillas in Colombia, or opium-financed mujahideen in Afghanistan, or ivory smuggling related to conflict, and we even call it blood diamonds, popularized term to describe the relationship between illicit trade in diamonds and conflict in West Africa and elsewhere. What I do in this book is actually look at the U.S. experience in this realm and show that it's actually a very old story. The United States mastered the relationship between illicit trade and war long before we talked about conflict commodities, blood diamonds, and so on. In fact, it goes back to the very founding. After all, how could George Washington actually supply his troops without massive smuggling of gunpowder from Western Europe and the Caribbean, since we actually had in the colonies no domestic gunpowder production capacity? And who made the money from the gunpowder? Well, one of them was in fact John Brown, one of the founders of Brown University, who sold gunpowder at exorbitant prices to George Washington, and there's correspondence saying, you're charging us these exorbitant prices, but we have no choice but to do it because of the extreme circumstances. John Brown probably emerged from the war, American Revolution, the richest man in Rhode Island, partly because he was such a profiteer from the American Revolution. Fast forward a little bit to the War of 1812. Most people don't remember this war. It's an obscure war, but profoundly important. One of the main reasons the United States failed to annex Canada was it turned out we were more interested in illicitly trading with them than fighting them. So cross-border residents were actually quite intertwined economically, not so enthused about fighting. And in fact, the British troops in Canada were greatly dependent on the smuggling of American beef to keep the troops alive. And they would have been in much more terrible shape if American forces could have stopped that flow. Another story, which Mark already alluded to, which is the whole intellectual property theft debate, which is a hot topic today, especially finger-pointing at China and other countries. In this chapter, I basically emphasize that the message to China and other countries on this realm is, do as I say, not as I did. And from the very get-go, America's mode of industrialization was not focusing at first on domestic innovation, but actually aggressive, widespread, enthusiastic, overt theft of European, especially British, technologies. Alexander Hamilton was the most enthusiastic proponent of it. There's almost official state policy that we need to go out and do this. Interestingly enough, another Brown brother has a crucial role here. Not John Brown, the bad brother, the slave trader, the profiteer from the war, but the nice Brown brother, the Quaker, the pacifist, the abolitionist, Moses Brown. How did Moses Brown play a role here? Well, he hired Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater is considered the grandfather of the American Industrial Revolution. He's given credit as sparking the whole thing. It's probably an overstatement, but go to Wikipedia or any site and he will be credited. He's been dubbed this forever in history. Well, who was Samuel Slater? He actually smuggled himself out of England in defiance of extraordinarily strict British immigration laws that did not allow machinists, skilled artisans like himself to leave the British Isles, precisely because if they did, they would end up helping other countries rather than England. So he pretended to be a farmer or some such, smuggled himself to New York. Moses Brown heard about him, brought him up to start a mill in Pawtucket, just up the street. And Moses Brown actually had some smuggled machinery for him to work on to see if it might help. Turned out to be mostly useless, so he kind of cannibalized the parts, and the rest is history. Another story is about fortunes made from illicit trade. Today, everyone's talking about how much money Pablo Escobar made. He actually made the list of Forbes list of wealthiest people in the world, and I think now a Mexican drug trafficker has joined that infamous list. If you're on the list, your days are probably numbered because you're getting a little too much attention. But if we look back in our own history, some of our founding family fortunes are built on illicit trade. And here, of course, I already mentioned the Brown brothers, but we can look to the Hancock family in Boston. We can look to America's first multimillionaire, John Jacob Astor. How did he make his money? He made his money dabbling in opium smuggling, dabbling in trading with the enemy during the War of 1812. Most importantly, he made his money by selling illicit alcohol to Native Americans in exchange for much coveted and profitable furs. This trade was banned by the federal government but poorly enforced. So his company, the American Trading Company, Fur Company, specialized essentially in exchanging alcohol for fur. And he's remembered as America's wealthiest man, first multimillionaire. Last but not least, there's much talk today in the immigration reform debate, but it's been going on for years now, how our borders are out of control. The language is we need to regain control. Well, how can you regain control of something if you never had control of it in the first place? In fact, America was built through highly porous borders, for better and for worse. From the very get-go, and this is the state building story that Mark alluded to, the very effort, however imperfect and failing, to try to regulate border crossings of all sorts built up the American state. And it starts with one of the first institutions of the American federal government at a time when it was so anemic, which was the Customs Service. What was Customs really trying to do? It's trying to enforce trade laws so we can stop the smuggling that was so rampant during the colonial era. A newborn country suddenly has to stop what it actually was encouraging its merchants to do just a few years earlier. Suddenly smuggling wasn't patriotic anymore. It was actually hitting at the core of state coffers. So We look at the U.S.-Mexico border as the sort of exhibit A today of out-of-control borders and the need to regain control. In fact, the immigration debate says we have to secure the border first before we can move it all forward in immigration reform. It's really a stalling tactic, but it also shows a gross disregard, ignorance of history. After all, by any historical standard, America's borders are far more secure, far more patrolled, far more surveilled, monitored, policed, and so on today than ever before in American history by a long shot, especially the U.S.-Mexico border. It's an old story. And as much as we focus on the U.S.-Mexico border, we can actually look back not too far in history to show that the U.S.-Canada border actually played just as important, if not more important, a role in illicit trade over the decades, over the centuries. As I mentioned already, it started with the War of 1812, but fast forward to Prohibition. The Detroit-Windsor crossing was just as much of a smuggling superhighway as Juarez, El Paso is today. But how quickly we forget. Today all the finger pointing is south, but actually back then there was a lot of finger pointing north. In fact, so much corruption that it was almost official state Canadian policy to actually tax the trade, give out permits for warehouses right on the river so that they could facilitate the moving of alcohol across the river, pretending that they were actually, these little boats, pretending that they were actually going to Cuba and other places, signing paperwork, looking the other way. So I'll end there. I've taken more time than I should, and I'll let my colleagues let me know how much they enjoyed or not the book. Thank you very much.
I now invite Catherine Lutz, Professor of Anthropology, to open up on Peter, or perhaps on Smuggler Nation.
Okay, great. Well, this is really a wonderful book, and I think it's going to be on the bestseller list. So it led me to go look at the bestseller list, because the book does strike me as distinctive. So you look, the books on U.S. history that capture the American imagination, or at least that have the best marketing teams, are a pretty narrow bunch. They tend to be about the founding, and that would tend to be reverentially capitalized, or they tend to be about soldiers at war, and they're properly saluted, of course. And they're also about individual U.S. presidents. And the worst warts there are often removed. So this week's no different. You look at that list, and the top 20 list on Amazon has 9 books on past U.S. military activities. Got snipers and SEALs and World War II missions and CIA hostage activities, rescues, and we've got Nick Terce's new history on Vietnam, on the Vietnam War, which is the only one with civilians in it. But again, it's part of this cluster of 9. And then there are 6 books on presidents, 2 of them on a founder, Thomas Jefferson, and 3, given Steven Spielberg's work, on Lincoln. So Peter Andreas' Smuggler Nation stands out in this crowd in several ways. First of all, rather than focusing on individuals and on their choices and values, as this kind of history often does, this Smuggler Nation investigates broader social and political processes through which named and often very colorful individuals move and do their work. Across an ambitiously long swath of 3 centuries, he takes us through these cultural and economic and political processes that in fact give us the very idea of a border. And he identifies the national and international declarations that make certain objects, for example, including certain classes of people, things that should not move across borders. Right? And that changes over time. For example, the British-led effort to suppress the slave trade, the racial categorization of who was or was not a desirable person to cross our borders at various points, duties and so on taxes and duties on tea and other things, which again come and go. So Andreas also tells us about the much broader and more significant consequences of the notion of smuggling. What's at issue is not whether just a certain quantity of drugs do or don't come across our borders, but the strengthening of federal policing institutions in general over the course of the centuries as a result of the attempt to control smuggling. Finally, the book's ambition is to put into historical perspective a variety of contemporary moral panics on illicit border crossings of various types. And those, we know these pervasive images of Chinese immigrants in boxcars, of tunnels under the U.S. border from Mexico with drugs running through them. Trafficked women is the latest moral panic about women who've come across to truck stops and so on. So the notion that Andreas is giving us is that prohibition itself is the original impetus to these kinds of economic strategies. Licitness or the legality of these things is the cultural and political economic phenomenon that he wants to draw attention to. And he shows that a piece of evidence is that what counts as smuggling, as I said, swings wildly through time. We can see the connections between these American panics and anxieties and the kinds of material conditions that, and the material interests of governments and smugglers and those who would make a profit by managing the border can also be seen throughout the book. So while speaking to the broadest audience of readers, Andreas's history also gives cases that show the value of a variety of kinds of academic work. And this includes, for example, the anthropologist Mary Douglas, whose ideas focus on how humans regularly do this. They regularly traffic in purity and danger at the site of all kinds of borders, so not just state borders, but the border of the body and other entities, where inflow and outflows are closely and anxiously monitored. His history is also consistent with moves across social sciences over the last number of years to focus on, to problematize the singularity or thingness of the state, of governments, and to understand the ubiquity of transnational flows. And his book stories illustrate what the anthropologist Carolyn Nordstrom and others have said about the cultural construction of the legal and the licit. Andreas and Nordstrom both treat licitness as more politics and culture than universal codes that the modern state enforces by nature. They also show how we tend to think of smuggling as the exception when, in fact, it may be more the rule. Smuggling turns out to be better conceived, not just a problem that the state tries to solve, but often as the route by which the state and the elite, who, even in a democracy, remain at the helm of the ship of state, are achieving, through which they're achieving some of their own ends. And again, this is the reason that Peter's book starts with his first footnote is to Charles Tilly, as Mark mentioned. And he famously reversed the conventional wisdom about the state and war. And I think Andreas's, we can see how Tilly's point about the state as a protection racket, which is the notion that the state garners legitimacy by protecting the people from threats that it itself has sometimes generated. In the same way, the smuggler is the figure that the state protects its people against, those who would violate our borders, and in that way garners legitimacy, even as Peter's pointed out in many, many of his examples, it's often tacitly or very explicitly encouraging such movements. I think there's a gender story here, too. That is a masculinizing project in a certain way, right? The masculine state protects the feminized populace from these threats, and so in that way there's a legitimation of a certain kind of gender scheme that we live with as well through the last 3 centuries. So my bottom line on the book is it's lively, it's unexpected, it navigates really expertly between the details of these cases of smuggled rum and broad national histories of such things as industrialization and changing labor relations and globalization. It's a national history that suggests we rethink the idea of the solidity of the nation, or the idea that a state comes into being, exists because it has borders and it exercises sovereignty with the stroke of a legal pen. I'd like to suggest that Andreas also implicitly points out that the emerging imperial reason that has created the distorted, a certain kind of imperial reason has created this distorted historiography that he's contesting and that he's replacing. It's that exceptionalist idea that America was founded on law, that even if it's now secular, is nonetheless seen to have been made by God, rather than founded in the more complicated human politics of the struggles that he's so well illustrated for us.
Thank you.
Now we'll have some reflections by Richard Snyder, Professor of Political Science.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's really wonderful to be here for a number of reasons. To celebrate the accomplishment of my friend and colleague, Peter Andreas, and especially wonderful because I remember sitting with Peter at T-Lux, which is just up the street from us, I think 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I don't exactly remember. And he had shared with me about a 7 or 8 page prospectus for what eventually became this book. And it's just a pleasure that it's now here and it can be shared with all of you and made public. And in a way, I feel like all I really ought to do today is just say, congratulations, Peter, and then sit back down. I will. No, I can't get away with that, you know. My role, in addition to that, is to push and pull and stir things up a bit. So I'll try to do my best. So Smuggler Nation has a lot of history. That's partly why it's such a fat book, Mark. History.
But it's an American history, so by definition it's short.
Well, it's partly a book of history, but this is a much more ambitious book than just a book of history, short or long. Peter very self-consciously tries to speak to the present, to use history to speak to the present, and even to policymakers. Now, this fits very nicely with the mission of the Watson Institute for International Studies that we are standing in today, which is to bridge the world of scholarship and practice, to bring scholars and practitioners together. So Peter's retelling of American history or American political development through the prism of illicit trade and efforts to control it is an example of what we might call publicly engaged historical analysis. If you don't like that term, if that's a little too stuffy for you, how about just useful history? Or maybe usable history. And the idea that history might be useful and even usable rests on a claim that the past can offer lessons for present action. To put this a bit more strongly, it rests on, as the philosopher George Santayana is remembered for saying, that the belief that, quote, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In other words, we neglect the past at our peril. Amnesia is dangerous. Is this true? Is this true? How useful, in fact, is history to practitioners, to people who must act in the present? There's an opposite view on the utility of history, opposite to George Santayana's. Another George Bernard Shaw, a quip from him is that we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. Another Shaw quote, we are made wise not by the recollection of our past, but by the responsibility for our future. There's actually a whole scholarly cottage industry on misplaced historical analogies, the misuse of history. Policymakers who learn the wrong lessons from the past. Maybe they don't repeat the mistakes of the past. That's nice. They have new mistakes. It may even be worse than the old ones. Some examples of misplaced analogies. There's a wonderful book by Yuan Feng Kong called Analogies at War. He provides the example of how in the summer of 1965, the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, invoked the Munich Conference at a cabinet meeting and succeeded in helping persuade Lyndon Johnson to escalate the war in Vietnam. Cabot Lodge argued, if the U.S. did not intervene in Vietnam, World War III would be unleashed. As he put it, quote, can't we see the similarity to our own indolence at Munich, end quote. So history can be misused. History, like many religions, is multivocal. That is, it's malleable. It can be interpreted and deployed in ways that consciously, strategically, or not, simply suit the interest of the interpreter. So, history can be useful, it can also be misused and even abused, both by scholars and practitioners, although I presume that abuse of history by the latter is more dangerous. So, for those who, like Peter, aspire to produce useful history, they need to walk a fine line between, on the one hand, the position that there's nothing new under the sun, and on the other hand, everything under the sun is new. So how does this book, Smuggling Nation, measure up? Is it useful history? Well, Peter, as he said at the beginning, his stated goal was to provide a corrective to presentist, often sensationalist views of history that grossly distort the novelty of the present moment. Examples include a recent book by Moises Naim, Illicit, How Smugglers, Traffickers, and Copycats Are Hijacking the Global Economy. Hijacking is pretty sensational to me. So how does Peter do in this book? I think he skillfully avoids, in providing a corrective to this presentist perspective, the other extreme, that there's nothing new under the sun. And I think this is most clear in the balanced concluding chapter. There's a subheading that is quite telling: continuity and change. Okay, so some things are new. For example, smuggling groups today, at least some of them, do have greater global reach than before, even if, on the other hand, the extent of this reach has been exaggerated by journalists, politicians, and scriptwriters in Hollywood. Secondly, something else that's new: the absolute volume of illicit trade is indeed probably larger than it used to be historically. Nevertheless, the relative share of illicit trade and overall global trade may not be so different from what it was. Things that used to be illicit are not illicit today. For example, marijuana is becoming increasingly more illicit, with medical marijuana as the wedge. A similar phenomena happened, interestingly, with prohibited, banned condoms, the beginning of the previous century, where medical arguments for the use of condoms were part of the explanation for the legalization of condoms. Licit products in the past may become illicit today. For example, as Peter notes, few slave traders in the 18th century could have imagined that slavery would be illegal. Okay, so what we get then is a balanced, more complex, more nuanced, and therefore less distorted and clearer picture of history. This balanced perspective that the book offers comes up in another way, which I think is very useful. There's a tendency, one dichotomy is then and now, and either then and now are totally different or not different at all. Another is good and bad, okay? And good actors, good guys and bad guys. The world can be divided into the good cops, the good regulators, the good enforcers, and the bad smugglers. Well, not so. Things are more complicated. Peter provides numerous examples of enforcers who are the bad guys. They're complicit in illegal operations that they are tasked with enforcing. For example, CIA exploitation of illicit networks during the Cold War, turning a blind eye to drug trafficking by anti-communist allies. Conversely, there are examples of criminals who are virtuous, or if not virtuous, at least legitimate. Peter mentioned at the outset patriotic smugglers during the colonial war of independence in this country. So we see a blurring of simplistic dichotomies between good and bad. Another virtue of the historical perspective in the book is, and Kathy alluded to this a minute ago in her comments, it brings dynamism in. And it does so by reminding you that what is forbidden now may not always be so. The impermanence of what is forbidden. It's an antidote to naturalizing things, to taking for granted that the way things are is how they've always been, how they will always be, and probably how they should be. Okay? And how does the book challenge this? Well, we have many very interesting episodes of demonization and also what we might call de-demonization or purification. These are very telling because it sheds a light on who gets to define what is forbidden and what is not, on the power to define what is legal and what is illegal. The book is chock full of these episodes. Patriotic smugglers before the Revolution of Independence become unpatriotic smugglers after the War of Independence. In the late 19th and early 20th century, we see the purity crusader Anthony Comstock, who crusades against pornography and condoms. Condoms are illegal. This is reversed, and other forms of contraception are illegal, reversed by medical, scientific arguments in conjunction with the utility of condoms for U.S. soldiers during World War I. I won't deconstruct the word utility for you here. There's a wonderful cartoon lampooning Comstock in the book. A lot of great illustrations I like very much. You can't see it, but it's got a picture of Comstock, and he's dragging in a young woman into the courtroom, and he's standing in front of the judge, and he says, "Your Honor, this woman gave birth to a naked child." So I think these processes of demonization, criminalization, and purification, or laundering, are very interesting. John Hancock, how was his image laundered? He was a smuggler. His family was involved in smuggling, but he's a hero. Brown University. When you think of Brown University being complicit in slave trading, doesn't come to mind for most people. This is a legitimate, good institution, but its roots are maybe not so pure. How is this laundering accomplished? I just gave a copy today to a visitor from Brazil, a copy of the report of the Brown Committee on Slavery and Justice about the university's historical relationship to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, an effort to provide a more balanced image of something pure. Okay, one last point, and then I've got to stop because I'm sure Mark's got that, that sort of shepherd's cane thing. That's why he sits over there, put around my neck. So how far does the argument travel, not historically for the U.S., but spatially to other countries of the world? Now, people have mentioned several times this twist that Peter makes on Charles Tilly when he comes up with the felicitous phrase that smuggling makes states and states made smuggling. What he means by states made smuggling is that state authorities get to define what is illegal and what is not illegal. He also argues, Peter argues, that all nations are smuggling nations. I think that's true. I work on Latin America. That's the region I know best. There's a phrase in Spanish, echa la ley, echa la trampa. Basically, you make a law, you make the loophole at the same time that you make the law. However, the power to be hypocritical is not distributed evenly across the globe. Some countries are not makers and breakers, but rather takers. Okay? In fact, most countries in the world are. So if states make smuggling by defining what is illegal and not legal, some states have a greater influence across the world than others. Okay? And I think here of countries in Latin America, the war on drugs, and to say that Colombia, Peru, Bolivia are smuggling nations in the sense that autonomously those governments, the governments of those countries and states of those countries, choose to define coca as illegal would not be useful. So it would be helpful to, well, for me to refer you to another book that Peter wrote called Policing the Globe, which takes on the issue of who gets to define what is legal, what is forbidden and not forbidden in a more comparative, broadly cross-national way. Okay, so let me conclude by thanking Peter for giving us a useful work of history.
Thank you. I'm now James Marone, also political science professor here at Brown.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be commenting on my colleague Peter Andreas' book. It's a splendid book. He takes things, as so many good books do, he takes things we've always seen and taken for granted and shows them to us in a quite dramatic new light. This may be a Rhode Island thing, but the idea of Samuel Slater, this man who had worked for Richard Arkwright, the inventor of the spinning jenny, crucial for textiles, and then recreated that textile mill from his head. The idea that this great tourist attraction in Rhode Island was a pirate takes some getting used to. As Peter says to China, sorry China, do as we say, not as we did. So what is marvelous about this book is to see the world anew. And to see so many parts of the world anew. You've gotten the sense already. This is about borders, it's about foreign relations, it's about government expansion, about economic development, about societal transformation, about American political development. It's also, I think, an important book for political scientists because it's so well written. There's a debate in political science, and Peter has weighed in heavily on this debate. I can make an important argument and not put you to sleep. I can make an important argument that people will like to read, and for that, this book is a clarion call in a debate about the nature of our discipline. And for that, I say cheers. Now, there's a puzzle running through this book. It's almost like there's two stories in it, and I want to tell you about the two different stories running throughout this book, and then try to sort out how to make sense of this puzzle. You see, story number one is the story of a nation that winks at rogues. It's a mischievous, tolerant nation. There's John Hancock, the big signature, the first man to sign the Declaration of Independence with a signature so large that, as he put it, King George will be able to see it without his spectacles. Smuggler. And that's okay. He's a patriot. In fact, can I say this on television? Peter appears as the first smuggler in this book, going from Bolivia to Peru, smuggling toilet paper. Don't ask, read the book. This comes up again and again in American history. We got the story of the Oklahoma land rush. It's not a national border quite, so it's not in Peter's book, but the Oklahoma land rush, there's a 1889, they line up thousands of people on the Oklahoma border, and at noon sharp, on April 22nd, cannons sound, and the military steps aside, and the settlers go rushing in to grab the land and discover that the best land is already staked out and taken. By whom? By people who cheated, by people who bribed the government agents, or were government agents themselves. And how does Oklahoma remember this? It calls itself the Sooner State, for the people who snuck in, the scalawags who snuck in sooner than everybody else. We celebrate the cheats. What a easygoing nation to cheer its rapscallions. There's another story, very vivid. It becomes more striking as the Andreas book goes along. And that's the story of a fearful, fretful, repressive nation, all at the same time. This winking nation and this repressive nation. Marijuana may sound like something that's finally coming of age, if that's what you want to do instead of drinking wine, but 2 years ago, 758,000 Americans were arrested for participating in marijuana. That's down from almost 1 million a few years ago. In fact, as Peter points out, the United States has the world's largest prison population, in some large measure for the very reasons he describes. 6 million Americans are in prison or jail on parole or under prohibition. 6 million Americans in the criminal justice system. This story of a repressive country, of a country that's fearful, frightful, comes to a point at the immigration story. This is a story that comes up multiple times, and all of a sudden, the story of the winking America becomes the story of a terrified America. And I think in the immigration story, we begin to see exactly what separates the two Americas. Immigration's and worry about immigration is as old as America itself. One of the first great American bestseller is a book by Maria Monk. She didn't really write it, a bunch of ministers did, but it's a pornographic account of the horrors of Catholicism. Priests kept nuns in convents and did terrible things with them, murdering the babies that they produced, etc. I was stunned to read in Peter's book that despite all those various forms of horror about immigration, it wasn't until the 1870s that immigration became a question of borders. And it became a question of borders about Chinese in the 1870s. The United States tried to resist paupers, criminals, prostitutes, lunatics, idiots, people with moral turpitude, and those with contagious diseases, and all wrapped around this fear that began of the Chinese immigrants. By the way, Mexicans, no problem at all. Mexicans could come and go as they wanted because they wouldn't stay forever. And in fact, the great wave of Chinese to smuggle in was to pretend that they were Mexicans. How things change. The immigration story, I think, kind of reveals the story of two Americas. When does smuggling trigger a particularly intense alarm? My reading of this book, Peter, I'd be interested to hear your comment, is when it's about, smuggling creates alarm, when it's about the definition of America itself, when it's about defining us as opposed to them. The endless debates of the culture war really trigger the most intense border protections that Americans know. When the question of Americanness, the question of who are we, is not at stake, the borders are quite loose. When it becomes a question of us versus them, when it becomes a question of culture war, then it's a different story entirely. And two stories, one tolerant, one intolerant, and the difference turning on this question, this construction of who we are. And to be a little bit provocative, I read this as a sort of series of levels. Economic smuggling is all over the map, sometimes taken intensely, sometimes not so intensely. Smuggling that turns moral, far more intense, not surprising in a Puritan nation. But the greatest intolerance is smuggling that has something to do with the question of who are we. The smuggling of Irish, the stories of the Irish, black Americans, Jews, Latinos, Muslims, those kinds of stories are the ones that really get America going. Let me conclude by just giving you one larger tale in this marvelous book, and that's the tale of Prohibition that I think ties together many of the strands that I've been suggesting. Prohibition, if you haven't read it and you haven't read the book, you'll be surprised to hear, is arguably the most sustained reform movement in American history. Not the one you would have picked. Nevertheless, there it is. If you take simply the number of people involved as percentage of the population, it's not even a contest. There were a series of waves. By the 1850s, 3 different states had outlawed alcohol. And then, after endless effort, a century of trying, Americans stop the drinking of alcohol. No, that's put wrong. Try to stop the drinking of alcohol from coast to coast. First, why does it happen? There's a series of explanations. One, foreigners again. The big cities, particularly on the East Coast, but Los Angeles fit too. The big cities were full of foreigners who hung out in saloons and had to be controlled. They were ruining America. The people in the heartlands who always voted for Prohibition were particularly worried about this threat of others. Race. The final wave of prohibition, for prohibition, starts in the South at exactly the time Jim Crow goes into place, between 1905 and 1915. And the idea of trying to control African Americans, needing to control African Americans, led to the idea that we had to control drink throughout the South. So prohibition becomes very important, all wrapped up with trying to keep African Americans in their place after 50 years of struggle following the Civil War. It was crucial for prohibition that the Democrats retook Congress, by the way, in the Wilson administration. Third, and very differently, it was a women's issue. It was a moral issue that was part of the effort to stop violence against women in the 19th and early 20th century. Wherever women's suffrage won, as it won in all the Western states, prohibition, in every case but one, followed on the state level the following year. The state but one was New York. World War I, as Peter writes in his book. So we've got foreigners, race, the moral uplift of gender, and finally World War I. World War I made the whole effort of prohibition a patriotic effort. At the commencement at Brown University, President Fonce looks out at the young men who are going off to fight and says, "You will be the great Christian army, the most Christian army the world has ever known." And then he turns to the rest of the audience and says, "And can we do anything less?" And then makes his appeal for prohibition. So a very mixed story in this chapter Peter tells, controlling them, moral aspiration, and patriotism. But the consequence is interesting, the rise of big government. The rise of big government is usually attributed to the New Deal, all those things Roosevelt tried. He never tried anything as ambitious as telling people from coast to coast, "Thou shalt not drink." And today, all the institutions built up to run down liquor are now cheerfully applied by the Supreme Court in the effort to run down drugs. Incidentally, speaking of marijuana, the narrative of prohibition, and here I differ with Peter just a little bit, the narrative of prohibition is what? A failure. The newspapers like to have their reporters go into a strange city and see how long it would take for them to find an illegal drink. And in the big cities, if it took you more than 10 minutes, you weren't really trying. But there's another narrative about prohibition, and that is that it succeeded. It succeeded in the conservative areas of the country, in the South and in the Midwestern heartland, in all the places that wanted to say, we're not like those people in the cities, we're not foreigners, we're Americans, and we believe in prohibition. To this day, half the counties in the United States are still dry. You just won't find those dry counties in places like Rhode Island. Which is just to say that the culture wars and the efforts at prohibition, so beautifully described in this book, go on. As everybody on the panel has said, that's not very good news for America or for our friends and neighbors around the world, but it's very good news indeed for the longevity, the legs that this book will have. Thank you.
I think it's only fair at this point that Peter responds to some of those comments. What do you think?
Actually, I'm not going to say much. I'm still digesting the comments. I must say that some of my colleagues explain and decipher and make sense of the book better than I did. So, and so I was thinking, what am I going to do with these comments? I said, next edition, I will have, and I'll footnote you appropriately. As I do. But actually, my preference would be to open it up to the audience. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to open up for questions. On this side, there's a mobile mic, and on this side, please stand behind the mic that's available on the stand. And we'll go from there. Mobile mic down here, please.
Hi, thank you, professors, for coming in today and speaking with us. You talked about the transition point at the beginning of the 1900s when the U.S. went from kind of a growth economy based on smuggling, at least partially, to the hypocritical switch to becoming this global enforcer against it. And that seems like a transition that a lot of countries around the world would like to replicate. So I'm wondering if you could for one, speak to what the catalyst to that transition was, whether it was kind of organic or circumstantial or due to policy issues. And then two, what could the governments down in South America, in Brazil, or in the new administration in Beijing, what lessons they could learn from Smuggler Nation?
Great question. One way to rephrase your question is, how did the United States become a hegemonic global policing superpower, right? And that's contextual in the sense that it's part of the larger rise of America as the world superpower. It's just that when we think of that, we think of military power. And we think of it in terms of economic power, the largest economy in the world. And so the addition here is to look at the law enforcement side of things, and not just domestically or at the border, but the aggressive effort to export our preferred policing priorities, laws, criminalizations, and so on. And this is actually drawing from the book that Rich mentioned, Policing the Globe, which I did with my co-author Ethan Nadelman, where it's quite striking. This gets to Jim Marone's piece about the moral righteousness of moralizing in American history, the other story, not the tolerance story, but, well, there's an exporting of U.S. prohibitions. So it's not just what's happening domestically. And so if you just, any UN, agreement on anti-trafficking, anti-money laundering, anti-drug trafficking, and so on, if you dig deep enough, you'll see fingerprints of U.S. officials all over them. So in a sense, the internationalization of anti-smuggling is also a story of Americanization of anti-smuggling. But it can't happen without the larger rise of America as a superpower.
Would anyone else like to jump in on this question, or shall we move to the next? Then we shall move to the next.
Yeah, let's move to the next.
Thanks for... Is it on?
Well,
No,
we can only
no.
hope. Please talk loud.
Yeah.
No, but use the mic because it has been recorded.
Thanks for the panel, and of course, thanks for writing the book. I wanted to ask Peter, most people who have spoken have talked about the theme of hypocrisy, as you have. And my question is whether the book is really about hypocrisy or whether it's about something else, namely liberalization or decriminalization of drug laws or a lot of things that are currently illegal. And here's the reason I ask this question is there are two ways to respond to hypocrisy or the charge of hypocrisy. One is to say, this person is a moralizer, they should stop moralizing, and stop criticizing others. But the other way to respond to the charge is to try to live up to the ideals that supposedly somebody was claiming to have. But at least as I hear you, I don't think that you think that a good response to the history that we've had in the past would be for the U.S. to start basically prosecuting more or to increase regulation within the U.S. in order to be less hypocritical abroad. At least my suspicion is that really your concern is about decriminalization and liberalization. So is that right, or is the response to the charge of American hypocrisy an equally good response would be more consistency, more domestic enforcement of the kind of limits on smuggling that we want to see internationally?
Another great question. It's on the hypocrisy, which I mentioned. The word doesn't appear in the book as far as I know, but what's interesting is I did a book event in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago and also last week at the Council on Foreign Relations, and all the commentators brought up hypocrisy. So it's like, I'm out to lunch. Everybody's read the book about hypocrisy, and but it's implicit, and it's so implicit that it hits you over the head over and over again. But I don't frame it that way. And again, next edition, hypocrisy will be underscored. But I'm trying to decipher your distinction between the two stories you just told about what the message is. And certainly the message, I don't want people to misinterpret it, certainly not in Washington, that, well, because the U.S. did X, everyone now today should be able to do X. So if you really took that logic to its logical conclusion, well, we would return to the slave trade, basically. We would have just a complete, return to some past practices that I don't think anyone really wants to return to. Or let's think, endangered species legislation, extremely imperfect, poorly enforced, very weak. But and there's massive smuggling of wildlife into the U.S. and other countries because it's relatively recent decades. The counterfactual is, without those laws, would these species in fact be extinct? And in some cases, it probably is true. So however imperfect, so no, it's not an argument for just, legalization, sweeping legalization, but it's interesting because one can read this book, I suspect some people will, as kind of a libertarian manifesto, and that would be partly right, but if to really claim that is to miss the larger point.
If I can jump in there, it's very interesting that Mark starts right from the beginning and says what does jump out at you when you read the book. It's a pretty hypocritical nation, but that the author says, I didn't see it that way. And I think you can read it sort of not as hypocrisy, but as how Americans have constructed the way they think about their borders. So if you come from a cynical perspective, you think they're delusional. They're either hypocrites or they're delusional. But I think Andreas is trying to get at something more complicated, which is how we construct the way we see the world. And so we don't have a category of smuggling as expansive as the reality. So we keep making these various constructions to kind of explain what we're about. And I think you could really see two different frames. One is a peculiar set of constructions, and that's what Peter's really seen and done. And then you sort of draw back at it and say, well, hypocrisy or delusional, because once you look at them, there's such a peculiar set of frames. But I think this is sort of, someone asked, you IR guys keep talking about constructivism. What is it? I'd hand them this book and say, read this, and you'll really get it. The policy implications are not at all systematic here. And really, some things he is really arguing, we should completely demobilize. This is stupid. I mean, he himself was smuggling toilet paper. Other things, he's saying, no. Watching it's horrible stories about wildlife being smuggled into the country. You want capital punishment for those people, what they're doing to the snakes and turtles and stuff. Yeah. So you can't just say this is an argument for or against a particular policy. It's deeper than that.
If you like trees, you want capital punishment for the toilet paper smugglers, too.
I shouldn't have let that one out of the bag, huh?
I have to read the preface.
And moving away from toilet paper, Ashu, would you like?
Two thoughts. First, as you said, or as you said and some others said rightly, America is not unique. One of the most famous wars of the British Empire is the Opium War, 1842, which allows Britain to take Hong Kong. Opium is illegal. It's imported from India, exported into southern China. It finances the importation of tea into Britain, and it provides a lot of supplement to balance payments, which the Crown encourages. We know that the British East India Company Army was stationed in India, but the Navy was the Navy of the Crown, and the two worked together. So, and there are other examples which can be cited. However, the second question is the more important one.
Yeah.
Even those who are not scholars of American politics like me, who've lived here for a very long time, and have read a lot about American politics, including from scholars of American politics, have noticed a deep moral urge returning again and again to American politics. Now, I have got your book only a few days ago. I haven't read it. Perhaps you solved this problem. I think it's partially there in what Corey is asking, but I have a slightly different take on it, a slightly different version of it. One can say that the deep moral urge of American politics, expressed, let's say, in Gettysburg Address, or some of the very remarkable debates of the founding of the Republic, some very remarkable things that a lot of leaders have said again and again, they're just a form of hypocrisy, utter falsehoods. Or one can take the position that Samuel Huntington has taken in his very interesting book. Not everybody agrees with it, but let me remind you what the basic argument was. American Politics, A Promise of Disharmony. One of the first books I read on American politics.
Yeah.
The last paragraph sums up the main argument. Europeans say America is a lie. America is not a lie, America is a disappointment. America is a disappointment, then he further argues. America is disappointment because the ideals it set itself were virtually unattainable in political life. So you would always have a gap between what America does and what America proposes as its ideals. That gap can be narrowed, but Huntington argues cannot disappear because those values laid out, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, are not simultaneously realizable. There'll always be an element, therefore, of underperformance. So is this underperformance of some kind, or at least to some extent, or is it outright hypocrisy?
You're not going to escape the hypocrisy trap.
Really?
I tried.
Coming round and round.
That's the theme of the evening. It's interesting, Asha. You asked is it this or is it this, and my instincts are that it's both. So there's a false dichotomy, if you will, and the ideals versus practice that Huntington pointed out as this huge gap. Arguably, and this gets to the comparative questions that Rich was alluding to, and actually you alluded to at the beginning of your comment, which is that's the very nature of the state. I mean, the gap between law and its actual enforcement. And some of those gaps are most glaringly apparent in the kind of smuggling activities that I point to. Arguably, the United States has had the most ambitious laws in some respects. Zero tolerance drugs, right? Secure borders, right? Just the very language, the war on drugs. No one else calls it a war, suggesting it's a super serious effort, right? So that suggests that the gap is a bit larger because the evasions are so glaring and the ambitions are equally glaring. So I guess in a sense I'm agreeing with Huntington, but sure, there's a hypocrisy here. Again, people talking about hypocrisy. Jim Morone mentioned just now that he thinks that maybe I don't think it's about hypocrisy. In some ways he's right, but in some ways I feel like it's so much about hypocrisy that I don't even have to say it. Why tell people the obvious thing in that sense? The last thing I'll say about your comments is the far better job than I can in terms of deciphering American moral outrage is my colleague Jim Morone's book, Hellfire Nation, which when I first arrived at Brown, within a year or two, he published it, gave me a copy. It's actually significantly fatter than this book. And I'll be honest, it was in some ways inspirational. I mean, here was a colleague who had rewritten American history over centuries through the narrative of moralizing and moral discourse and focusing mostly on religion. And light bulbs went off in my head, and we had many drinks and dinners over this. It's like, I can tell a more political economy story over various forms of smuggling. So where we actually overlap in this history is the Comstock story and the sex trafficking and anti-pornography and birth control eradication efforts and so on, and the prohibition story, which he rightly ended his comments on. Other places we diverge dramatically, but even that Comstock cartoon, I'll be honest, the one that Rich Schneider mentioned, it's the one image in the book that I had to track down that was in Jim Morone's book. And it was the hardest to track down because I couldn't find it anywhere. So finally I said, Jim, where did you get it? This archive in Yale University Library. So they kindly photographed it for me and sent me the copy. And so that one image is similar in both books. So I was pleased that the publisher allowed me to reproduce over 40 images, as long as, of course, I paid the royalties for that. Last but not least, not to take up too much time, I was looking in the pages here when you were first talking about, other countries being smuggler nations and so on, and the British story, the opium trade. In the introduction, towards the end, I'll just read a short paragraph. There is nothing uniquely American about smuggling, of course. To varying degrees and in various ways, all nations are smuggler nations. Indeed, some have even been smuggler empires. Consider, for instance, the crucial role of opium smuggling in financing the British Empire in the 19th century. No so-called drug cartel today comes remotely close to matching the power of the British East India Company, which enjoyed a near monopoly on the China opium smuggling trade in its heyday. Yeah.
More questions? Comments? Interjections? Or we're going to have to talk about hypocrisy again, so come on. Yeah. Bring it on. Oh, back again?
Yeah.
Are we still a smuggler nation?
Oh, yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Part of the point of the book is that history continues, and we're very much a smuggler nation today. But part of the point of the book is all the alarmism and anxiety and hand-wringing in Washington over the fact that we are a smuggler nation today has all these historical precedents, and arguably, depending how you look at it, interpret it, it's less consequential today than it was at America's founding. Less consequential today, you know, in the industrialization story, for example, or Western expansion story, various wars of the 19th century that the United States was you know, implicated in, and including America's own Civil War. I mean, we talk about blood diamonds, I mentioned it. Well, we could have talked about blood cotton if some NGO would come up with the term in terms of America's the South's dependence on smuggled cotton. But absolutely, this is where the issue of change is, where Rich mentioned in his comments. It's not just a book about continuity, but change. So the realm of cyber smuggling, right? This is totally new and different. It's still smuggling, but it's inside a cyberspace, virtual world. There's no territorial borders that are being physically crossed. But we're massively a smuggler nation in that regard. We're a smuggler university, a smuggler student body. My students are experts at downloading music illegally and movies illegally and so on. And the police, you know, you get notices at your dorm saying you've used too much. Students actually, you're right, you're getting notices telling you to stop downloading so much, and you'll get your system cut off otherwise. So that's new and different, right? The endangered species is new and different in terms of recent decades. I have a bit of discussion at the very last chapter about the black market baby trade, which we don't talk about much. Everyone kind of just, it's kind of uncomfortable, hush-hush, but frankly, the United States is the #1, to use a crude word, importer of babies in the world, and a certain number of them, unknown number of them, come through adoption processes that are very questionable. Gray markets where Guatemala actually had to shut down its adoption business because it was so corrupt, and so much examples of actual trafficking. And that just doesn't get the attention that it does, but it's part of the profile of the United States today as a smuggler nation in a way that wouldn't have been true, say, a century ago.
And you could add organs, human body parts as well.
Yes.
Right?
Technology is an important piece here. Technology has enabled not just the cyber smuggling, but also the organ trade and so on. Though another point I make in the book in the last chapter is technology also can put some illicit trades out of business. So you can imagine, fast forward into the future, if you can actually artificially create some human organs, and reasonably accessible and cheaply, it'll put out the black market organ trade. So it may just be a transitional thing that lasts for X number of decades. Please.
Peter, one of the
Come closer to the microphone, please.
One of the greatest stories in your book is how bureaucracies have grown hand in hand with prohibitions, and especially with drug prohibition and illegal migration. I think we're still far away from any big change in those areas, but I will be curious to know what you think, what will be the future of those bureaucracies if the rules were to change in terms of drugs and illegal migration. What will happen with the DEA, with all those huge bureaucracies and their budgets?
It's a great question. The immigration question is we've already determined what's going to happen. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, is defunct. It was folded into the Department of Homeland Security. So a single issue agency, INS, of which immigration control is its core mission, is now part of a larger Homeland Security mission, which at the top of the list is prioritizing counterterrorism, right? So, and regardless, I don't see any dramatic liberalization of borders to the flow of people anytime soon, though there will be some reforms coming up if things go as the Obama administration hopes in Washington, certainly in relationship to Mexico. Drugs, though. See, what's different, an interesting difference between the FBI, say, which is the largest federal police force, and the DEA. The DEA is a single-issue agency. Its very survival depends on a singular focus on one thing, whereas the FBI will never be put out of business because there's a shift, counterterrorism, organized crime. Organized crime is involved in lots of different activities, racketeering, and so on. So they've got a long, healthy life ahead of them. DEA, take marijuana out, you start, it's potentially more problematic. An interesting hint of the problem facing the DEA, and they've actually grown dramatically in recent decades, is after 9/11. So they're a single-issue agency, drugs, 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 drugs. Suddenly, the name of the game in Washington is terrorists, terrorists, terrorists. So suddenly, the main theme at the DEA is the relationship between terrorism and drug trafficking, to show the relevance of their issue area for the hottest issue of the day, which is terrorism. So they're testifying in Congress, there's whole hearings on the relationship between drugs and terrorism and so on. I'm not suggesting those links don't exist or they're not important or whatnot, but it's just interesting how the selling of their job shifted to saying, hey, we are crucially important to the war on terror.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So I'm
Can you come closer to the mic?
Yeah. In a lot of cases, most every case, illicit trade is illicit for a reason because whatever trading is being done is harmful to states, to people, to civilians. But I was wondering if you could maybe speak to examples where this sort of trade might be beneficial in any some way. If you've ever walked down a street in a Latin American city or an Asian city, you'll see bootlegged American DVDs on the ground being sold, and that's completely illegal. And I'm not saying intellectual property stealing is ever really beneficial, but at the same time, there is sort of this soft power effect where American ideals, pop culture are spread throughout the world through illegal means. So, why don't you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Kind of a two-part question, or a comment and then a question. One is that just sort of you stated a starting point was that illicit reflects some kind of harm automatically, and frankly, one of the stories in the book is, well, not necessarily true. I mean, alcohol is now perfectly legal. We take it for granted, but it's far more harmful than marijuana. One is illegal and one's not. So there's not an automatic, correlation between criminalization and the harm something causes to society. But your story, your second point, which was framed in terms of a question, was really how much harm is this sort of bootleg copies of this or that in the streets of Mexico City or Lima or whatnot. And frankly, it's a mixed bag at worst and relatively benign at best. It's certainly such a low priority for law enforcement that the companies that are most concerned about this often have to coax them, actually pay them, or pay private security firms to do some of the enforcing to take it seriously. Because basically cops around the world have one thing in common, which is violent crime trumps other types of crime. Murder's the most important thing. Well, IP theft is, in the spectrum of violent illicit trades, it's the less violent of them. And your last point was quite telling, which is there is an upside for companies. What is the word? Plagiarism is the greatest form of flattery. So if you are a brand name company, you've made it. You are it. When people want to copy you and pretend they are Rolex or Puma or Nike or whatnot, and yes, they complain bloody murder about it, but their brand is in fact being proliferated for free around the world, right? So there's an upside. In fact, arguably, there's even a recent book written about this by Cal Rostiella at UCLA Law School, that even the fashion industry, the rip-off of those designs, actually spurs innovation, and that we have to be very careful about not getting too sort of draconian about cracking down, because we may actually repress creative forces in the first place.
I think I just want to reinforce the point Peter made in response, that harm and legality are separate dimensions. I mean, to believe that everything illegal is bad and everything legal is good, you would have to believe that guns are good, they're legal, and condoms are bad because they were illegal during an earlier period. And one of the great utilities or uses of an historical perspective, and also a comparative cross-national perspective, is to alert us to the menu of feasible options historically, of possibilities, and in the contemporary moment. You can travel to other countries where things that are illegal in one place are not illegal there, and get a sense of what things might look like in the original country. And you can travel in time historically to moments when things that are legal now were illegal, and get a sense of possibilities that breaks you out of simplistic equations.
Please.
I'm very interested. We've gone almost an hour and a half, and you did talk about the Browns, but you didn't talk about another immigrant family, which you may have, that went from smuggling to the next generations went into public service, and that's the Kennedys.
Yeah.
And is that discussed?
It's a good question.
He's married to a Kennedy, so no.
It's interesting. There's a lot of mythology about Joe Kennedy as some kind of smuggler during Prohibition, but the best recent book written about Prohibition is by someone named Daniel Okrent, and it served as the basis for the recent PBS documentary series. Earl Morris, I think, was the director, I'm not sure, on the Prohibition era. He devotes a whole last section of the book, not very long, but the myth of Joe Kennedy actually being involved in smuggling. He did make money off of alcohol right at the end of Prohibition, but technically speaking, he was more of a speculator than a smuggler. But somehow, it's interesting, there is this sort of taken for granted mythology that made this money bootlegging. No, the real profiteers in this particular story were the Bronfmans from Canada who bought Seagrams. And then some of their family members actually funded the Center for European Studies at Harvard and funded many totally respectable, legitimate institutions in Canada. They got their start through Prohibition and pushed, sometimes aggressively, competitors aside. So they had this questionable origins and completely went legit after Prohibition. So the Bronfmans in Canada actually a much bigger story than almost any alcohol smuggling family we can point to.
Interesting. The California wine industry also got a huge boost from Prohibition. They would send out casks with warning labels that said, "Warning after 6 months. If this liquid is this grape juice is allowed to sit for 6 months, it will become alcohol and illegal." And people bought it, but it was a storm. And they really expanded the industry through, because it was hard to get wine, which was heavy, has a lot of volume, unlike whiskey. And so that was part of the genesis or the fertilization of the California wine industry.
Well, two examples like that, seeing as we're on booze, something I know a great deal about. One of the, if anyone's went to San Francisco, the cocktail of choice, of course, involves Fernet Branca, which is a sort of Campari-type liqueur. And it was basically made to a formula that could convince anyone on the customs side that this wasn't alcohol. Because it's so aromatic and so spicy and so dark that it's some kind of herbal medicine. And quite a lot of alcohols in that period were made that way. The other one, of course, is the relationship between the Greeks and white wine and the whole notion of retsina, which is putting basically pine oil into your wine to the point that it's undrinkable, at least if you're Turkish, because they were the one charging the taxes. Further questions? Issues? Comments? I think we'll say thank you very much to Peter, thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for coming.
Everyone should have something like this.